I'm Margaret Lloyd. I'm the Small Farms Advisor for Yellow Solano in Sacramento County. I work with a lot of the organic vegetable producers, the mixed vegetable farms, small scale farms. And today I'm very pleased to be hosting Corey Shake. Corey Shake is a partner biologist with Point Blue Conservation Science and the USDA NRCS. He works with farmers and ranchers to improve ecosystem health on working landscapes and monitors wildlife populations and other ecological responses to conservation practices. So it's the rare moment that I get to have my presenter at home with me, so we get to have a little bit of a live experience here. And it's also a rare chance that I get to hear Corey give a presentation. So thank you, Corey.
You got it.
He's going to go to his own working space in the home office. So without further ado, I will hand the mic over to Corey. And thank you, Corey.
Thanks for the introduction. Nice to sit next to my wife on a Zoom call and then come over to another Zoom pane. But thank you all for joining, taking the time out. I'm sure those of you are growers. It's a busy time. It's also a very busy time for field biologists. I've been running all over the place on various projects. I'll describe a few of them a little later, but it has been busy. So today, I'm calling this talk Growing Food at the Farm Edges. And this is, for those of you who are growers, producers, you all work very hard and put a lot of effort and thought into growing food for humans. And I want to just kind of pivot and talk about, who else you have the opportunity or who you may already be growing food for in that ecological community around your farm. And so I'm going to focus specifically on birds, bees, and butterflies, which are those are kind of the groups of animals that I know best and that I work most closely. And I'm going to focus primarily on a lot of my own personal experience, but I also look forward to, at the end of the presentation, hearing from you about your personal experience and what you've learned about how birds, bees, and butterflies have used either habitat you've created or habitat that you have on your farm. And in the backdrop here, I have a satellite view of hedgerow farms. Many of you who might be here in Yolo County, I understand everybody's not fully local. I work primarily in Yolo County, but hedgerow farms is an institution of a place where a lot of native plant seed is grown, but also a place where they demonstrate their practices, and particularly hedgerows. So I wanted to pay respects there, and also pay respects to the late John Anderson, a good friend of mine as well. In talking about, growing food here for the birds, bees, and butterflies, this is where I wanted to just kind of give this context and say, oh, I need to advance my slide here. Give this context and say, essentially you feed a community of humans when you grow produce and or other food crops. But Aldo Leopold's, who, if you're not familiar, kind of one of the forefathers or grandfathers of wildlife and ecology, and wrote the book, A Sand County Almanac, and developed this idea of a land ethic. And I think what I wanted to bring into this is that his quote here, that the land ethic simply enlarges the boundaries of the community to include soils, waters, plants, and animals, or collectively the land. So I know that many of you spend a lot of time thinking about soil and water, and of course the plants you're growing. But this is that extension of the idea of growing food and or providing habitat for other parts of the ecological community. And in this case, I'm going to talk about bees and butterflies. So to give you a little context of who I am and what I'm doing here in Yolo County, the work that I do, I work for Point Blue Conservation Science, which was formerly known as, or originally founded in 1965 as the Point Reyes Bird Observatory. And we've grown and changed since then in many ways. Now our breadth of work that we do is expanded beyond mostly bird or avian science, essentially, to encompass a lot of things. And most recently, in the last like 10 to 15 years, a lot of it has been pivoting towards kind of agroecology. And we have a group in particular called the Working Lands Group, where we focus on ecology and sustainability of working landscapes like ranches and farms. And so at the core of that group is our 10 partner biologists, which I am one of these. And we call them partner biologists because we're in partnership with the NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, the USDA agency. And we're embedded in those NRCS offices in a local field office. So I am in the Woodland field office and report directly to the district conservationist there. And there's 9 other partner biologists from Mariposa all the way up to Modoc and out to Humboldt, who in different county offices that do this work. So part of what we do is help NRCS with their mission of conservation planning and getting conservation practices implemented on the ground. We do that largely through the EQIP program, which is the cost share incentive program. It's a voluntary program that many of you may have engaged with. And I know, actually, I'm certain some of you have because I've worked with you. But EQIP is, a way to put government money towards, federal government money towards doing conservation practices, like a lot of the habitat practices that I'm going to talk about. And I focus primarily on the habitat practices, both in rangelands and on farmland and cropland in the valley. I focus a little more on the cropland side here in Yolo County. And I'll also just put it in context and say that I've also been blessed to be in Yolo County and because of the fact that the university's here and there is a solid set of growers who really think about all of these things in regards to habitat and agroecology. And so there's been lots of opportunity for me to learn a great deal from a lot of really great scientists and farmers and ranchers. So one thing that we do a little differently as our partner biologists, there's actually partner biologists all over the country with different NGOs partnering with the NRCS, but ours in particular, we do a couple of different things. One of those, a big important part of this is that we do biological monitoring to essentially evaluate the conservation practices that we have implemented or our NRCS colleagues have implemented with farmers and ranchers. So we go the next step on the adaptive management, where instead of just getting things done and then hoping they do what we say we want them to do, we go out there and actually measure bird populations, or in the case of rangelands, soil health and plant communities. And then I also have developed a program of doing bee and butterfly monitoring down here in the valley. So doing that, the birds, bee and butterfly monitoring from the rangelands up in the hills through the farmland on sites that have been restored, or the newest project is we're removing an invasive species called arundo, where the RCD is, and I do most of these projects in partnership with the RCD. And if you're not familiar, that's the Resource Conservation District, the local arm of kind of the conservation picture in each county. And so I partner with them on several of their projects. And the most recent one is that arundo project, where I'm monitoring change in bird communities and plants before and after that arundo is removed. So, and I was out doing that this morning, setting up plots to monitor birds. So that's where I'm coming from. I've been in this position for 7 years now and have been studying birds starting as a field ecologist almost 20 years now, and then kind of turned my focus a little more towards bees and butterflies in maybe the last 8 to 10 years. And have developed some skills along with that. So I'm going to break this up into 3 parts. The first one is this, where I'm going to just talk about and give some background on where and when do birds, bees, and butterflies occur on farmland, potentially on your farm. Just to give you a little context that, there's both questions of where the habitat is, but also when the animals are using them, using those different habitats. And then in part 2, I'm gonna dive into specific plants that are connected to specific birds, bees, or butterflies. It's not gonna be an exhaustive list, but it's gonna be a list of things that I think are very important plants to try and incorporate more into habitat improvements, habitat augmentation. So I'm going to get started here and then on the final part 3, that's where I'm going to actually ask you all to give me some feedback on plants or other habitats that you've seen that really are supporting bees, butterflies, or birds. I see it as a fun way to share observations about what you see on your own properties. So to get started on part 1, just to get everybody, typically in the Sacramento Valley, I'm going to focus this kind of on the southern Sacramento Valley. In farmland, you can kind of lump the habitat areas. I got them here in 3 categories. This is just to give you some context, but these are the places that I see sometimes can be prime real estate for a lot of these winged creatures that I'm talking about, and also beyond what I'm talking about into other beneficial insects that you might all be interested in for pest control, or other sets of wild native, like mammals, for example. But the first kind of habitat that's typical in the croplands of the Sacramento Valley would be riparian habitat. And riparian just means, vegetation essentially close to a water body. Usually that's a creek or a stream or river, but would even include ditches or ponds in this case. And because there's that water there, it supports unique vegetation, unique plant species, which then in turn supports unique birds, unique insects, and all of, kind of has a different set of species that are possible to be found in those riparian areas. And that the picture I have there that's actually Cache Creek flowing along right next to Cape Organic, the farm there right near Cape town, and which I've done a bit of work on, including some bee and butterfly counts. And then I kind of classified it into farm edges, and you may have existing farm edges, habitat that never got essentially removed when the land was developed for agriculture. So that's a possibility. But there's also, habitat that you may have created through, planting a hedgerow or some other kind of planting along ditches or sloughs that is maybe shrub dominated. I'm kind of separating that out, but these certainly can be, and hedgerows certainly can be and include trees, like things like valley oaks or willows and that kind of a thing, especially if there's the water to support some of those more riparian species like willows or cottonwoods. And then finally, there's essentially the herbaceous or the kind of grass and wildflower or kind of weedy plant edges of farms, which I'm calling herbaceous here. And that's a photo there of one that was intentionally planted. I think that was actually, I think that's on Rachel Long's farm, I'm pretty sure she could confirm. But and that was, I think, Rachel, that was planted by UCD and Neil Williams Lab, is that right? If you're listening.
Yeah, hi Corey. Yeah, so the forbs were planted by Neil, and the shrubs and sort of trees like the
Red bud.
anyways, the red bud and such, those were planted by me and Dave back in like 2000. So it's been there for quite a while.
Great, yeah, and the Forbes, I think that photo of mine is from 2014 or 15, something like that, when you had a field day out there, and it was beautiful. So yeah, there's these herbaceous farm edges, and each of these kind of has the capacity. You can essentially put different plants in each of these, and they support different sets of species potentially, especially with regards to birds, because birds really respond to habitat structure. So when you add trees or woody plants like shrubs, then that really changes the game in terms of what species are going to be there, as opposed to if you just had a grassy edge or a wildflower edge or something like that. Although those plants are, equally important often for birds in either producing fruit or seeds for a lot of species. So that's how I've broken it up here. But a really important concept too is the seasonality of this habitat and when the animals are active and using the habitat, because these animals' life cycles and their phenology with the timing that they're active or alive, or in the case of plants, or in the case of bees, butterflies, they have shorter lifespans, or they spend different parts of their life at different, active at different times of the year. So there's a lot going on in terms of, for birds and butterflies in particular, there's migrations that can bring different birds at different times. And then there's breeding season for all these different species, when there might be more activity or higher numbers of certain birds or butterflies in some cases, and bees even. And then flight season, that's more of a term used for bees, about when certain species are active. Some species are only active for 4 to 6 weeks in a year, and then the rest of the time they exist either as an egg or a larval state or a pupa down in the ground somewhere, or in some other substrate where they nest. So the flight season's interesting and important. So, but in general, the way I see it kind of in the Sacramento Valley, there's kind of where all these things are, where there's kind of high abundance or particularly high diversity of things, is what I call the high season, is April through July, when there's a lot of blooming plants, and it's warm. Most of these insects need warmth to do well. And then also food's abundant, both from a standpoint of, for insectivorous birds, there's a lot of insects to eat, but for those insects, there's a lot of pollen and nectar, or other plant matter that some of these species need. So that's the high season, and then it kind of turns to late summer and fall, and there are still some unique plants that bloom later in the year and support a different set of fauna, a different set of birds and bees and butterflies. But like the birds, for example, most of them, their breeding tapers off and their activity tapers off. They're still feeding young at that time of year, so there's still lots of need for food, but the activity is different. And then in winter, a lot of things migrate away or go into dormancy, or in these different states of, like I said, mentioned the egg or pupa states. And that's I'm labeling as December through March. And there's also birds that come in, in the winter, for example, sparrows coming from all parts north of here, as far north as Alaska, for like golden crown sparrows in Western Alaska. They're here in big numbers. So sparrows like golden crown, white crown sparrows, but things like savanna sparrows as well in our grassland or farm edge areas. It's really impressive, the numbers that come down. And I used a picture of a rice field here because you can walk a rice levee in the winter, and it's say 100 yards long, and you might flush out 10 to 20 savanna sparrows on this little strip of habitat, and you multiply that over hundreds of fields. There's probably a lot of savanna sparrows out there. So I just wanted to point out all these different times, because I think it relates to what you're planting for, if you're looking at what plants to plant, it's important to know when they're going to serve different animals and what animals will be active. And it's important, a really important concept is just the idea that an overarching goal, especially for providing nectar and pollen resources for bees and butterflies, but also this can apply for providing fruits for birds that eat fruits, is that they need to be producing pollen, nectar, or fruit at different times of the year. And all these plants have different phenology. So you try to aim to diversify that timing. So part two, going to talk about I'm going to just pull out some what I call high impact plants that maybe there's not enough of in the work that I've done. So in these bee and butterfly bird counts that I've been doing in the Valley recently, there's definitely periods of time where there's a lack of resources, and some sites where they don't have certain plants, you just don't see the numbers of particularly bees and butterflies. So I'm going to try and draw out those things that I think will help fill those gaps in a way. So, and then talk a little bit about where you can plant them. I'm going to do this in order of kind of like trees, shrubs, and then the herbaceous plants. So first of all, some really great trees to get on the landscape, kind of wherever you can. There's some limitations here. Willows and cottonwoods are riparian species and do need more water than, say, a valley oak typically. And even valley oaks might have some limitations, but typically in the valley, they're fine and can get enough. But willows, so some characteristics of these trees in general, when they get mature, they have furrowed bark, which creates a lot of space for insects to hide, and then thus birds to come find food and eat. So they're used heavily by bark gleaning insectivorous birds, and I'll show you some examples of those. But then also some of these are larval host plants for specific species of butterflies. And then another big one, these trees can get pretty big. They end up, once they get big and old and mature, or even once they die and turn into snags, they provide a lot of nest cavities for birds that nest in small nest holes. And there's species of birds that specifically only nest in cavities. So willows, for example, there's a lot of species, but here's one example where they're larval host plants for two beautiful butterflies. Up on the left, top left there, that's a mourning cloak. They emerge, one of the earliest butterflies to kind of be out flying around, and sometimes, in February, March even. And you'll find those in riparian areas because their host plant where they lay their eggs and where their larvae eat and grow up is on willows. Same with Lorquin's admiral, that small butterfly, or it's also actually a pretty medium-sized butterfly, beautiful butterfly just below there. Valley oaks, though, I mean, there's so many species that use and love valley oaks, both as nesting places, but also as great places to forage from the bird side. And one of the most beautiful ones, I think, to point out here is the Bullock's oriole, just pictured there, that bright orange bird in the top left of that valley oak picture. But there's so many more. Ash-throated flycatchers, Western bluebirds is a big one, just love valley oaks. And then there's also, oaks are also a host plant for this little butterfly here. It's called the mournful dusky wing. Its name, even scientific name, is even Tristis, so it's mournful in both names. And it lays its eggs on various species of oaks, including valley oak. And then cottonwood, I put in cavity nesting bird species here, like the white-breasted nuthatch in the top left, and the Nuttall's woodpecker on the right there, bottom right, because cottonwoods, once they get old, they do have a lot of nest holes and a lot of opportunity for cavity nesting birds. I also want to point out that most of these bird photos, or almost all of them, are from a gentleman named Tom Gray. You can check out his webpage, but he's been very generous in letting us use photos. And then a lot of the butterfly ones come from Art Shapiro's butterfly site, and you can check that out for credits for the photos. Now into the shrubs that are great species to plant on your property, or if you already have them, to take notice that they're there and take care of them. Mule fat is a early blooming species that it starts blooming, I think, this year. I think sometimes even in late February, but it was probably more March, usually more commonly March, but it's a great bee and butterfly plant both for nectaring and pollen. And then, you know, a lot of these big shrubs produce great fruit, particularly elderberry, a lot of you are familiar with, toyon as well, and birds of different seasons come in usually. So the mule fat, I put a picture of a bumblebee here because bumblebees are one of the earliest emerging bees to come on the scene, and they sometimes start showing up as early as, you know, January or late January, but more often in February and then March. But they need those first resources. Willows are also a great one. Willows are really early blooming, provide nectar and pollen pretty early. And then on the elderberry, I put a unique species here, the phainopepla. It's not super common, but it loves to eat elderberries and also particularly mistletoes, and it's just usually almost always associated with mistletoe. So if you weren't ever fond of mistletoes, there is a good reason to have it around, because if only to feed a bird that's beautiful named a phainopepla, bright red eye and the black body. The males are black. And then toyons you see in the winter. So this is a cedar waxwing pictured over the toyon there. That's a bird that comes in flocks in the winter season and is still around. It hasn't migrated, but some of them have probably migrated up to their breeding areas up in the mostly in the west, in the montane west, and the forests of the west. But in the winter, they're down here roving around, eating lots of different kinds of fruits, and toyons are a superb berry for them. So now into low. So when I say low, I mean shorter statured. So maybe anywhere from 3 to 6 feet tall. Most of these are 3 to 5 feet tall, low shrubs. A lot of them are, you can find some good ones that are very attractive to bees. They provide nectar, fruit, and seeds for birds. Buckwheat, I think, would be a good seed producer. So I'm not sure, you know, what birds eat or use that one in particular, but and then some are very late season bloomers. Buckwheat can be a good one. It has a very long bloom season that can go from you know, they might start soon in the next month or so sometimes, or maybe in another month, and then they'll bloom all the way into October, maybe even November in some cases. And then there's bladderpod. I put a question mark here. Bladderpod's not, and you'll notice that all these plants I'm presenting are natives. Hopefully we'll have time to, you know, if you have ideas of plants that are not native to California or native to our area, you know, I'm open to those ideas. We'll talk about that later. But bladderpod's an interesting one because it's kind of a Southern California desert plant, but in some places here in the county, it seems to persist and do well. And it blooms almost literally year round. And you definitely see honeybees use it a lot. I don't know how much it gets used by, and honeybees are the non-native, you know, introduced or managed bees. But I don't know how much it gets used by native bees. Maybe somebody has some observations on that. Some connections here, Cleveland sage and or coffeeberry, which I didn't picture. You know, aside from being great bee plants, both of those, and also blooming, you know, in the kind of the late spring, sometimes early summer. They're great, particularly salvia is great for hummingbirds. That's an Anna's hummingbird over the picture there, and I've seen them coming in and nectaring on salvias a lot. California buckwheat, I've even seen hummingbirds nectaring on buckwheat, but it's just such a dynamite bee plant and butterfly plant for both of them foraging for nectar and or pollen. It's very high on top of my list. And then bladderpod, as I mentioned, there's a honeybee visiting a bladderpod. Now into the wildflowers, and particularly the perennial ones that you know, they'll die back and you won't see them, but then they'll emerge next year as green plants. A huge one that I just have to mention because we have the monarch butterfly here in the West, which is so very much imperiled, and we're nearly on the brink of extinction for that subspecies of the monarch butterfly here in the West, but milkweeds are so important. So that's a narrowleaf milkweed in the picture, but also there's a couple other species that could be used in plantings. And then gum plant, another one that has a long bloom season potentially and is just so attractive to bees. Goldenrod and aster are ones that I mentioned because they are late blooming, and they could be blooming, you know, in the August, September, October time period, which is a time when there's not a lot of other blooms around. So that's why they made my list. And now into more annual wildflowers, which you would be seeding more than likely. And it is challenging to seed and establish some of these. But it can be worth it if you can get it done, especially maybe start with smaller plots when you do this. But some of the big ones, some of the early bloomers that are great are phacilias or lupins, really coveted by bees in different ways. And there's some good research from UC Davis that has shown how well used phacilias can be, and also lupins. That lotus that I have pictured there is actually a perennial wildflower, so everyone catches that. But there's other lotuses that are annuals that you can seed into these seed mixes. And the reason I put the lotuses in here is because they are host plants for particular butterflies that like pea family plants like lotus, but also sometimes lay eggs on clovers and so forth. And then finally sunflowers, just because they're so attractive to bees, and they tend to bloom a bit later. So there's one of the butterflies that uses lotus a lot and to lay eggs on as host plants. That's a eastern tailed blue butterfly, beautiful little critter. And then, you know, on sunflowers, you often see these longhorn bees that I pictured on top there as well. So that's the highlights of these species that I wanted to pick out as really important. And you'll notice that a lot of those were really pointed at trying to get, those are species that are blooming often later in the season and covered times when there's not a lot of other things blooming. And I think that there has been, even here in Yolo County, there's been a lot of hedgerows planted, but there's often been a reliance on a certain set of maybe 5 or 6 species that do really, really well, and they're easy to establish, but there is gaps in when those are providing particularly bee and butterfly habitat because they're not blooming. And so a lot of the plants that I highlighted try to cover those gaps, and that's why I put a lot of them in there. So as I said, it's not an exhaustive list, but those were some really solid plants to consider. And now what I'd like to do, we have plenty of time allotted to continue the conversation as much as you all are interested in engaging this way. But I would like to ask you to share your observations. In particular, if anyone wants to pick out any particular plants, and I'm going to be taking notes here because I don't claim to know all of these things, and I would love to learn what other things could, or maybe incorporated in farm edge habitat type planting. So you can comment on anything, any plants that you see in particular that are just teeming with bees or birds or butterflies, or you just see high use of those plants by any of those species, and particularly native bees, but also honeybees is good information too. Or if there's, one thing I didn't talk about at all was introduced or herbal or culinary plants that I know a lot of people use even for, beneficial insectary plants that are not at all native plants, but, you probably have some observations of how much they're used. And then if there's places that I haven't talked about where these plants could be planted or established, including, within the rows of your crop production, I'd love to hear about that as well. And then, this is also time for general questions. So thanks for your time for listening, and I hope we can carry on the conversation here.
Thank you so much, Corey. That was a really valuable set of information. I learned a lot.
Thanks.